The howling wind had been my only companion for 3 winters, until I saw him, a small shadow stumbling through the white hell beyond my cabin window. His tiny frame bent against the storm like a sapling in a hurricane, each step more desperate than the last. The blizzard of 1912 had already claimed 2 prospectors from the valley below, their frozen bodies found weeks later when the thaw began. I pressed my face to the frost-covered glass, watching this child fight against nature's cruelest embrace. My heart hammered against my ribs as memories of another boy, another storm, another loss flooded back. The kerosene lamp flickered in my trembling hand, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Something told me this night would change everything, that the silence I'd wrapped around myself like a burial shroud was about to shatter, but I had no idea how deep the roots of this moment would reach into my buried past. I dropped the lamp on the table and threw open the heavy wooden door, the Arctic air hitting my face like a slap from God himself. "Boy!" I shouted over the wind's banshee wail, my voice swallowed by the endless white expanse. Snow whipped around my ankles as I stepped onto the porch, the planks groaning under my weight and the storm's fury. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, his clothes nothing more than tattered rags that offered no protection against Alaska's merciless cold. His lips had turned the color of winter violets, and his small hands were clenched into fists that he kept pressing against his chest. I could see him trying to call out, but the words died in the wind before they reached me. The distance between us seemed to stretch like an eternity, each second ticking by like a death sentence. What kind of monster would leave a child to wander alone in this frozen wasteland? My boots crunched through the deep snow as I fought my way toward him, each step a battle against the wind that seemed determined to push me back. The cold bit through my wool coat like hungry wolves, and I could feel ice crystals forming on my eyelashes. 20 feet felt like 20 miles as I struggled through drifts that came up to my knees. The boy's eyes locked onto mine, pale blue, like winter sky, filled with terror and something else I couldn't quite name. He stumbled forward, his small arms reaching out as if I were his last hope in this white purgatory. I could see his mouth moving, forming words that the storm stole away before they could reach my ears. My own breath came in sharp puffs that froze instantly in the brutal air. Something about his face tugged at a memory I'd tried to bury years ago, but the thought slipped away like smoke in the wind. When I finally reached him, his tiny body collapsed against mine with the weight of pure exhaustion. His skin was ice cold to the touch, and I could feel him shivering violently through his thin clothes. "It's all right now," I whispered, though I wasn't sure he could hear me over the storm's roar. I wrapped my arms around his fragile frame and lifted him against my chest, surprised by how light he felt, like carrying a bundle of birch twigs. His head lolled against my shoulder, and I could feel the weak flutter of his pulse against my neck. The journey back to the cabin seemed to take forever, each step carefully placed to avoid the hidden roots and rocks buried beneath the snow. My muscles burned from the effort, but I held him tighter, knowing that letting go would mean his death. As we reached the porch, I caught sight of something metallic glinting against his chest, half hidden beneath his torn shirt. Inside the warmth of my cabin, I laid him gently on the old sofa near the fireplace, his small body barely filling half the cushions. His breathing was shallow and rapid, like a frightened animal caught in a trap. I rushed to stoke the fire, adding split logs until the flames roared back to life, filling the room with flickering orange light. The heat began to chase away the brutal cold that had followed us inside, but the boy remained deathly still. I knelt beside him and began peeling away his frozen clothes, each layer revealing more of the damage the storm had inflicted. His skin was mottled with frostbite, and his fingernails had turned an alarming shade of blue. I wrapped him in every blanket I owned, creating a cocoon of warmth around his tiny frame. But as I worked, that metallic glint caught my eye again, and my blood ran cold when I realized what I was seeing. Hanging from a thin chain around his neck was a military medal, tarnished black with age and weather. My hands trembled as I leaned, closer, trying to make out the inscription without disturbing his fragile sleep. The medal was scratched and worn, but I could still see the faint outline of an eagle and the remnants of engraved letters. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as fragments of memory began to surface. Memories of another man, another medal, another life I'd tried to forget. I reached out to touch it, then pulled my hand back as if the thing were made of fire. The firelight danced across its surface, revealing glimpses of words that made my heart stop beating for several terrifying seconds. This couldn't be happening. Not after all these years of silence and solitude. The coincidence was too impossible, too cruel for even God to allow. I spent the next hour tending to his frostbite, rubbing warmth back into his hands and feet with gentle, methodical movements. His skin gradually began to pink up where the circulation returned, and his breathing became deeper and more regular. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke and melting snow as his clothes dried by the fire. I prepared warm broth on the old iron stove, the familiar routine of caring for another person both comforting and terrifying. It had been so long since I'd heard another voice in these walls, so long since I'd had reason to cook for anyone but myself. The boy stirred occasionally, mumbling words I couldn't understand in what sounded like delirium. I found myself watching his face in the firelight, studying the curve of his nose and the shape of his jaw. The resemblance I thought I'd seen outside was growing stronger, more undeniable with each passing moment. As midnight approached, he finally opened his eyes, those startling blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Ma'am," he whispered. His voice cracked and hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. I moved closer, offering him a cup of warm broth that he accepted with shaking hands. "What's your name, child?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. He took a sip of the broth and looked up at me with an expression far too old for his young face. "Tommy," he said simply. "Tommy Carson. I've been looking for my pa." The cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the wooden floor, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. Hot broth splashed across my boots, but I barely noticed because that name, Carson, was carved into my heart like a scar that never healed. The boy who had stumbled out of the blizzard wasn't just any lost child. The metal around his neck caught the firelight again, and this time I couldn't look away from the inscription that had haunted my dreams for 7 long years. Even through the tarnish and wear, I could make out the name James Carson etched into the metal, along with the date of a battle I remembered all too well. My late husband's best friend, his brother in arms, the man who had promised to take care of me if anything ever happened, the man who had disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness without a word, leaving behind only questions and a broken heart. I stared at this child, this living, breathing reminder of everything I'd lost, and felt the carefully constructed walls around my emotions begin to crumble. Tommy Carson was here, in my cabin, wearing his father's medal and searching for a man who might already be dead. But if James was alive somewhere in this frozen hell, I was the only person in 100 miles who would know where to look. Sleep eluded me that night as I sat in my rocking chair, watching Tommy's small chest rise and fall in the firelight. The metal lay against his collarbone like a dark secret, its tarnished surface reflecting the dancing flames in ways that made my heart ache. Every creak of the cabin walls in the wind reminded me of nights I'd spent waiting for James to return from his prospecting trips, back when hope still lived in my chest. I could still remember the weight of that same medal in my own hands, the day he'd shown it to me with such pride after receiving it for his service in the Spanish-American War. "It's all I got left of who I used to be," he'd said, his calloused fingers tracing the eagle's wings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was his son, carrying the only proof of a father he'd probably never truly known. But how had Tommy ended up alone in this wilderness? And where was James now that his boy needed him most? The questions multiplied in my mind like snowflakes in a blizzard, each one colder than the last. Dawn came slowly, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold through my frost-etched windows. Tommy stirred as the first rays of sunlight crept across the cabin floor, his blue eyes blinking open with the confused look of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. I rose from my chair, my joints protesting after a night spent keeping vigil, and moved to check on his condition. The color had returned to his cheeks, and his breathing was strong and steady. The resilience of youth had served him well. "Good morning, child," I said softly, not wanting to startle him with sudden movements or loud voices. He pushed himself up on the sofa, wincing slightly as feeling returned to his frost-bitten fingers and toes. The metal slipped from beneath the blankets, catching the morning light and sending small rainbows dancing across the cabin walls. I found myself staring at it again, unable to look away from this tangible connection to my buried past. Tommy noticed my gaze and instinctively covered the metal with his small hand, a protective gesture that spoke of hard-learned lessons about trust. "That's a fine medal you're wearing," I said carefully, testing the waters of his willingness to talk. Tommy's eyes grew wary, the same look I'd seen in cornered animals who weren't sure if I meant help or harm. "It was my pa's," he said simply, his voice still hoarse from his ordeal in the storm. "He told me never to take it off, said it would keep me safe when he couldn't." I moved closer, settling into the chair beside the sofa with movements I hoped seemed casual rather than desperate. "Your pa sounds like a wise man. Can you tell me about him?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from the fireplace. Tommy's fingers tightened around the metal, and for a moment, I thought he might retreat back into silence. But then something in his young face shifted, as if he'd decided I was worth the risk. The story he was about to tell would either confirm my worst fears or lay them to rest forever. "Pa's been gone for near 3 months now," Tommy began, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of a child who'd repeated this story too many times. "He left me with Mrs. Henderson in Fairbanks, said he had to go up to the Klondike region to check on his claim." I felt my blood chill at the mention of that cursed place where so many men had lost their lives chasing gold and glory. He promised he'd be back before the first big snow, but the storms came early this year and there ain't been word from him since. Tommy's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away, the effort of appearing strong taking its toll on his small frame. "Mrs. Henderson, she said she couldn't keep me no more, not with winter coming and her own family to feed." The casual cruelty of abandoning a child struck me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Tommy continued, his voice growing smaller with each word, and I realized he was telling me about the journey that had nearly killed him. "I heard some men in town talking about a woman who lived alone out here in the wilderness," Tommy said, glancing up at me with something that might have been hope. "They said she was hard as winter itself but fair, and that she'd helped folks before when they had nowhere else to go." The description made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. Was that really how the world saw me now? I figured if I could find you, maybe you'd help me look for Pa, or at least let me stay until spring comes. His words hit me like an avalanche, the weight of his trust and desperation settling on my shoulders. I thought about the long, lonely years I'd spent in this cabin, hiding from the world and the pain it had brought me. Now here was this child, asking me to step back into that world, to risk everything I'd built in my solitude. But the medal around his neck made the decision for me. James Carson's son deserved better than abandonment. The question was whether I had the strength to give it to him. I reached into the wooden box beside my chair and pulled out a photograph that I'd hidden away for 7 years. Tommy's eyes widened as he saw the image of two men standing beside a mining claim, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of true friendship. "That's my pa," he exclaimed, pointing at the taller figure on the right. But who's the other man? My throat felt tight as I looked at my late husband's face, frozen forever in that moment of hope and brotherhood. "That's my husband, Samuel," I said quietly. "He and your father were partners, closer than brothers. They served together in the war, prospected together, shared everything." Tommy studied the photograph with the intensity of someone memorizing every detail. "Your pa gave Samuel that medal when he got sick. Said it belonged with the man who'd saved his life more times than he could count." The words came out harder than I'd intended, carrying the weight of old grief and newer fears. But Tommy deserved to know the truth about the bond between our families. Samuel died 5 years ago from lung fever, but before he passed, he made me promise to keep that medal safe until James came back to claim it. The lie came easily, a small kindness to spare the boy from darker truths about his father's disappearance. Tommy's fingers traced the edges of the photograph, his young mind working to piece together the connections between past and present. "So you knew my pa real well then," he said, more statement than question. "Yes, child, I did. And if he's still alive out there, I might be the only person who knows where to look for him." The weight of that responsibility settled on me like a stone in my chest. But there was no turning back now. Tommy's face lit up with the first real smile I'd seen from him, transforming his features from exhausted desperation to something approaching hope. The sight of it nearly broke my heart, because I knew what lay ahead of us in the frozen wilderness. But James Carson had been my husband's best friend, and that bond demanded more from me than safe silence. I moved to the old trunk beneath my bedroom window and retrieved the maps Samuel had drawn of the Northern Territories during his final prospecting season. The paper was yellowed with age, but the careful markings showed every trail, every camp, every dangerous passage between here and the Klondike. "Your father had 3 favorite spots where he liked to winter over," I explained, spreading the maps across the kitchen table. Tommy scrambled off the sofa to join me, his bare feet padding across the cold wooden floor. "Here at Moose Creek, here near Eagle Summit, and here at a place called Blackwater Gorge." My finger traced the routes between each location, calculating distances and dangers in my mind. If he's still alive, he'll be holed up in one of these spots, waiting out the worst of winter. Tommy studied the maps with the serious expression of someone far older than his years, and I realized this journey would either save him or destroy us both. But as I looked at his face, so much like his father's it made my chest ache, I knew I couldn't let him face this alone. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow," I said, the words surprising me with their finality. Tommy's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and fear, the reality of what lay ahead beginning to sink in. "The weather should hold for another few days, but after that, we'll be racing against the next storm system." I began making lists in my head, supplies, routes, contingency plans for when everything went wrong. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were already closing in on the life I'd built here in isolation. "Mrs.?" Tommy began, then stopped, realizing he didn't even know my name. "Call me Eleanor," I said, testing how the name sounded after years of speaking only to myself. "Eleanor Whitmore. And Tommy, I want you to understand something. This journey we're about to take could kill us both. The mountains don't care about our good intentions or your need to find your father." His face grew solemn as the truth of our situation settled between us like cold morning mist. But when he looked up at me with those startling blue eyes, I saw the same stubborn determination that had driven his father into the wilderness time and again. The morning air bit through my wool coat like shards of broken glass as Tommy and I loaded the wooden sled with supplies that might mean the difference between life and death. 3 days' worth of dried meat, Hardtack and coffee beans filled one corner, while my husband's old rifle and ammunition occupied another. The weight of responsibility pressed down on my shoulders heavier than the pack strapped to my back, but there was no turning away from what had to be done. Tommy moved with surprising efficiency for such a young boy, checking and double-checking the rope bindings that held our meager possessions to the sled. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he worked, and I could see the determination etched into every line of his small face. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow that looked like dark fingers reaching toward us. I had spent 7 years avoiding this moment, 7 years hiding from the world, beyond my cabin walls. But James Carson's son deserved more than my cowardice, and Samuel's memory demanded that I honor the bonds forged in friendship and war. We set out northeast toward Moose Creek, following the frozen Tanana River through stands of pine trees that stood like silent sentinels in the wilderness. The snow crunched beneath our boots with each step, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my anxious heart. Tommy walked beside me without complaint, though I could see the effort it cost him to match my longer strides through the deep drifts. The sled runners cut smooth tracks behind us, marking our passage through this white wasteland like a breadcrumb trail that might lead us home or to our graves. Every few hundred yards, I stopped to scan the tree line for signs of movement, knowing that bears and wolves weren't the only dangers lurking in these frozen forests. The silence between us felt comfortable rather than awkward, as if we'd both understood that words were a luxury we couldn't afford in this harsh environment. But beneath that silence, I could feel the weight of unspoken questions and the terrible possibility that we might never find the answers we sought. The first day's journey would take us 12 miles into territory I hadn't visited since Samuel's death. By midday, we reached the place where Birch Creek merged with the main river, and I called a halt to rest and share a meager lunch of dried venison and melted snow water. Tommy sat on a fallen log, his cheeks red from the cold, but his eyes bright with excitement at being on the trail at last. "How much farther to the first place where Pa might be?" he asked, tearing off a piece of the tough meat with his small teeth. "Another 8 miles. To Moose Creek, but we'll make camp tonight at Bear Ridge and tackle the final approach in the morning." I studied the map again, noting the steep terrain that lay ahead and the narrow passes where avalanches could bury us without warning. The weather had held steady so far, but I could see high clouds gathering on the northern horizon like harbingers of the next storm system. Tommy followed my gaze and frowned, his young mind already learning to read the signs that meant survival or death in this unforgiving land. "Will we make it in time?" he asked quietly, and I heard the fear he was trying so hard to hide. The honest answer would have crushed his spirit, so I gave him the lie that hope sometimes requires. As we resumed our journey, I began teaching Tommy the skills his father should have passed down: how to read animal tracks in snow, how to identify the subtle changes in weather patterns, how to move silently through forests where sound carried for miles. "See those marks there?" I pointed to a series of indentations near a cluster of pine trees. "Wolf pack, probably 6 or 7 strong, passed through here maybe 2 days ago." Tommy's eyes widened as he studied the tracks, his mind working to memorize every detail I shared. "The lead wolf was limping on his front left paw. See how that print is shallower than the others?" He nodded eagerly, soaking up knowledge like a dry sponge absorbs water. These lessons might save his life someday, especially if something happened to me out here in the wilderness. The thought of leaving him alone in this frozen hell made my chest tight with panic, but I pushed the fear down and focused on the present moment. We had a job to do, a man to find, and ghosts from the past to lay to rest. Everything else was just noise in the wind. 3 hours later, we found the first signs that made my heart skip with cautious hope. Fresh snowshoe tracks crossed our path, near a stand of black spruce, the prints clear and well-defined despite the wind that had been steadily erasing our own trail. Someone came through here within the last day, I whispered, kneeling to examine the impressions more closely. The tracks were made by an adult man, someone familiar with wilderness travel who knew how to distribute his weight evenly across the snow. Tommy crouched beside me, his young face intense with concentration as he studied what I was seeing. "Could it be Pa?" he asked, hope making his voice crack with emotion. "Maybe, child. The stride length looks about right for your father's height, and these are military-issue snowshoes like the ones James always preferred." I traced the edge of one print with my gloved finger, feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that came with closing in on answers. But tracks could lie as easily as they could reveal truth, and I'd learned not to trust hope until it proved itself worthy. Still, for the first time since we'd left my cabin, I began to believe we might not be chasing ghosts after all. The tracks led us off the main trail and up into the foothills, where the going became treacherous and slow. Pine branches heavy with snow brushed against our faces as we followed the mysterious snowshoe prints through stands of timber that seemed to close in around us like walls. The sled became a burden as we climbed steeper slopes, forcing us to stop every few minutes to catch our breath in the thin mountain air. Tommy's face grew pale with exhaustion, but he never complained or asked to rest longer than necessary. "Whoever made these tracks knows exactly where he's going," I observed, noting how the trail took advantage of natural windbreaks and avoided the most dangerous exposure. "Your father always had a gift for reading terrain and finding the safest route through difficult country." The prince led us past a series of rocky outcroppings where the wind had scoured the snow down to bare stone, making tracking more difficult. But I could still see scuff marks on the rocks and the occasional clear impression in sheltered spots that confirmed we were still on the right path. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. As twilight approached, we crested a ridge and found ourselves looking down into a small valley where smoke was rising from the chimney of a rough log cabin nestled among the pines. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized the structure. It was one of the emergency shelters that prospectors had built throughout the territory for exactly this kind of situation. The snowshoe tracks led straight down the slope toward that distant curl of wood smoke, and I felt Tommy's small hand slip into mine as we stood together on the ridge. "Is that where Pa is?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that sighed through the pine boughs above us. "I don't know, child, but someone's down there, and they've got a warm fire going." I studied the scene through the gathering. Darkness, looking for any sign of movement or danger before we committed ourselves to the descent. The cabin looked peaceful enough, but I'd learned that appearances could be deceiving in country where desperation turned ordinary men into killers. The smoke continued to rise straight up in the still air, a beacon of warmth and possibility in this frozen wasteland. But as we prepared to make our way down the slope, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to discover something that would change everything. Moving down the treacherous hillside took all our concentration as we worked to keep the sled from running away from us on the steep, snow-covered terrain. Tommy stayed close behind me, following in my footsteps and helping to guide our supplies around the largest obstacles in our path. The cabin grew larger as we approached, and I could see that someone had recently cleared snow away from the door and windows. Fresh-cut firewood was stacked neatly beside the structure, and animal tracks in the surrounding snow suggested that whoever lived here was an experienced hunter and trapper. "Stay behind me when we get to the door," I instructed, Tommy quietly, checking to make sure my rifle was easily accessible. "Let me do the talking until we know what kind of reception we're going to get." He nodded solemnly, understanding that we were about to cross a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. The warm yellow glow of lamplight spilled from the cabins. Single window, and I could hear the faint sound of someone moving around inside. My palms were sweating inside my gloves despite the cold, and every instinct told me to turn around and head back to the safety of my own cabin. But Tommy's faith in me was absolute, and James Carson's medal still hung around his son's neck like a promise waiting to be kept. We reached the heavy wooden door just as full darkness settled over the valley like a thick blanket. I raised my hand to knock, then hesitated, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether we'd found salvation or walked straight into catastrophe. Tommy stood pressed against my side, his small body trembling with cold and anticipation as we waited in the circle of yellow light that spilled from the cabin's window. The smell of wood smoke and cooking food drifted out to us, reminders of warmth and comfort that seemed impossibly distant after our day of hard travel through the frozen wilderness. I could hear a man's voice inside, talking quietly to himself, in the way that people do when they've been alone too long. My heart pounded so hard I was sure Tommy could hear it, but I forced myself to reach up and rap 3 times on the solid wood door. The voice inside stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching across a wooden floor. A bolt slid back with a metallic click, and then the door swung open to reveal a figure silhouetted against the warm lamplight within. The man who stood before us was tall and lean, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to look right through us into the darkness beyond. But it wasn't James Carson, and the disappointment hit me like a physical blow as our first hope crumbled into ash and shadow. The stranger who answered the door stood like a mountain against the warm glow of the cabin's interior, his weathered face carved by years of harsh winters and harder choices. His eyes moved between Tommy and me with the calculating wariness of a man who'd learned that visitors in the wilderness rarely brought good news. "Well, I'll be damned," he said slowly, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. "Eleanor Whitmore, ain't you? Samuel's widow?" The recognition in his tone sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic air swirling around us. I couldn't place his face, but something about the way he said my husband's name made my hand drift instinctively toward the rifle at my side. Tommy pressed closer against me, sensing the tension that crackled between us like electricity before a storm. "That's right," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "And you are?" The man's smile was thin and cold as winter moonlight, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of tobacco and neglect. But it was the way his gaze lingered on Tommy that made my blood run cold with maternal protection. "Name's Marcus Dolan," he said, stepping back to gesture us inside with movements that seemed almost mocking in their politeness. "Come in out of the cold before you freeze to death on my doorstep." The cabin's interior was sparse but functional, with rough-hewn furniture and the kind of organized efficiency that spoke of a man living alone by choice rather than circumstance. A pot of stew bubbled on the iron stove, filling the air with the rich smell of venison and wild onions that made my stomach growl despite my growing unease. Dolan closed the door behind us with a finality that sounded like a trap snapping shut, and I noticed he took care to slide the heavy bolt back into place. "Mighty strange, finding Samuel's widow wandering the wilderness with a young boy," he said, settling into a chair that gave him a clear view of both the door and our position near the fireplace. "Especially in weather like this, when most folks with any sense are hunkered down waiting for spring." His tone was conversational, but I could hear the questions lurking beneath his words like predators stalking prey. Something about this man felt wrong, dangerous in ways that went beyond the normal caution required when meeting strangers in the wilderness. Tommy's small hand found mine and squeezed tight as he sensed the undercurrents flowing through the cabin's warm air. "We're looking for someone," I said, choosing my words carefully while studying Dolan's reaction. "The boy's father went missing near Moose Creek, and we thought he might have taken shelter in one of the emergency cabins." Dolan's eyes sharpened with interest, and he leaned forward in his chair like a wolf catching an intriguing scent. "Missing man, you say? Well, now that's interesting. A lot of folks go missing in these mountains, especially this time of year. He reached for a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him and took a long pull before continuing. Course, some of them ain't exactly missing if you catch my meaning. Some of them just don't want to be found. The way he said it made my skin crawl, and I began to suspect that our search for James Carson had led us into something far more dangerous than winter weather. "What's the missing man's name?" Dolan asked with studied casualness. But I could see the predatory intelligence glittering in his pale eyes. The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a funeral pyre. "James Carson," I said, watching Dolan's face for any flicker of recognition or guilt. The change was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders that told me this man knew exactly who we were talking about. "Carson," he repeated slowly, rolling the name around on his tongue like he was tasting it. "Can't say the name rings any bells, but then again, I don't make it my business to keep track of every prospector who wanders through these parts." The lie came too easily, too practiced, and I felt the familiar weight of my rifle against my shoulder like an old friend offering comfort. Tommy's breathing had grown shallow beside me, his young instincts picking up on the danger that seemed to radiate from this stranger like heat from a forge. "Though I will say," Dolan continued, his smile growing wider and more unpleasant, "it's mighty curious that you'd bring a boy along on such a dangerous search. Almost like you're running from something rather than looking for someone." His words hit too close to home, and I realized we'd walked straight into the web of a spider who'd been waiting patiently for prey to stumble into his parlor. I was about to make an excuse to leave when Dolan stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, his movements casual but purposeful. "Funny thing about prospectors," he said, rummaging through the contents with his back turned to us. "They tend to carry all sorts of interesting things when they travel through remote country." My blood turned to ice water in my veins as he turned around, holding a familiar-looking leather pouch, the kind Samuel had always used to carry his gold dust and personal papers. "Found this a few weeks back, half buried in the snow near Eagle Summit. Belonged to a fellow who seemed to be in quite a hurry when he passed through." Tommy gasped beside me as Dolan opened the pouch and shook out its contents onto the rough wooden table. Among the scattered papers and personal effects was a small photograph, the same one I'd shown Tommy back at my cabin, showing Samuel and James together at their mining claim. "Recognize this, do you?" Dolan asked, his voice dripping with false innocence. "The fellow who owned it was mighty protective of his possessions, fought like a wildcat when I tried to relieve him of the burden." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow, and I realized we'd found James Carson's trail, but not in the way we'd hoped. "Where is he?" I demanded, my hand moving to rest on the butt of my rifle, despite knowing that Dolan was probably faster and certainly more ruthless than I could ever be. "Where's James Carson?" The mask of politeness finally slipped from the stranger's face, revealing the cold-blooded killer that lurked beneath his practiced charm. "Oh, he's around," Dolan said with a chuckle that raised the hair on the back of my neck. "Though he ain't much for conversation these days, if you catch my meaning." Tommy whimpered beside me, his young mind struggling to process the horrible implications of what we were hearing. See, Carson had himself a real nice stake up near Blackwater Gorge, and he was mighty reluctant to share the location with a fellow prospector in need. Dolan's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure as he watched the understanding dawn on my face. But after a little persuasion, he became much more cooperative. Even drew me a map before he decided to take a long winter's nap, under the ice. The casual way he spoke about murder made my stomach lurch with revulsion and terror. We weren't just lost in the wilderness. We were trapped in a cabin with a man who killed for gold and felt no more remorse than a wolf killing a rabbit. My mind raced as I calculated our chances of escape, while Dolan continued his grisly confession, like a man who enjoyed having an audience for his crimes. "Course, there's still the matter of the boy," he said, his gaze settling on Tommy with an expression that made my maternal instincts scream warnings. Carson kept babbling about a son, kept saying someone would come looking for him if he didn't make it back to town. The pieces of Dolan's plan began falling into place with sickening clarity. He'd been waiting for us, knowing that someone would eventually follow James's trail into these mountains. Can't have witnesses wandering around loose, you understand. Bad for business. He moved closer to us with the casual confidence of a predator who knew his prey was cornered. But I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Whitmore. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement. The hunger in his eyes as he looked at me made my skin crawl, and I knew with absolute certainty that neither Tommy nor I would leave this cabin alive unless I did something desperate. The weight of my rifle felt both heavier and lighter than it ever had before, the difference between salvation and damnation measured in fractions of a second. But Tommy was depending on me, and James Carson's spirit demanded justice for the crime that had been committed against him. The tension in the cabin stretched taut as a bowstring as I slowly began to shift my weight, preparing for the move that would either save us or seal our fate. Tommy seemed to sense what was coming and pressed himself against the wall behind me, making himself as small a target as possible. "Now don't go doing anything foolish," Dolan warned, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt with practiced ease. "I'd hate to have to hurt the boy before we've had a chance to discuss terms." The threat against Tommy shattered the last of my restraint, and I felt the cold fury that had sustained me through 7 years of grief and isolation surge through my veins like liquid fire. "The only terms you need to worry about," I said, my voice deadly calm despite the chaos raging in my heart, "are the ones you'll be making with your maker." The cabin erupted into violence as I brought my rifle up in one smooth motion, knowing that our lives depended on the speed and accuracy that Samuel had drilled into me during our years together. Dolan lunged forward with his knife gleaming in the lamplight, but he'd underestimated the desperation of a woman protecting an innocent child. The shot echoed through the cabin like thunder, and Marcus Dolan crumpled to the floor with a look of surprise frozen on his face. But even as his blood began to pool on the rough wooden planks, I knew our ordeal was far from over. In the ringing silence that followed the gunshot, Tommy and I stood frozen in the aftermath of violence that had transformed us both in ways we were only beginning to understand. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood, creating an atmosphere that would haunt my dreams for years to come. "Is he dead?" Tommy whispered, his young voice shaking with shock and terror at witnessing his first taste of human mortality. I knelt beside Dolan's still form and confirmed what my shot had accomplished, then quickly began searching through his possessions for any clue about James Carson's final resting place. The map Dolan had mentioned was tucked inside his coat pocket, crude but detailed enough to show the location of what he'd called Blackwater Gorge. "Tommy," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands, "we need to gather our things and get out of here. There might be others coming, and we can't be here when they arrive." The boy nodded numbly, his eyes fixed on the spreading pool of blood as his innocence died along with the man who'd threatened us. We had found the truth about James Carson's fate, but the knowledge came with a price that would change us both forever. The real question now was whether we had the strength to finish what we'd started and give a father the burial his son deserved. We left Dolan's cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying with us the weight of blood on our hands and the crude map that would lead us to James Carson's final resting place. Tommy walked beside me in stunned silence, his small frame hunched against more than just the bitter cold that cut through our layers of wool and leather. The sled felt heavier now, loaded not just with supplies, but with the terrible knowledge of what we would find at Blackwater Gorge. Every step took us further from the safety of civilization and deeper into a wilderness that had already claimed too many lives, but there was no turning back from the promise I'd made to a dead man's spirit. The stars overhead burned like ice crystals in the black sky, offering just enough light to follow the treacherous trail that wound between towering peaks and bottomless ravines. "Mrs. Eleanor," Tommy whispered as we navigated a particularly narrow passage. "What if we can't find him? What if the snow's too deep or the map ain't right?" His questions echoed the doubts gnawing at my own heart, but I couldn't let him see the fear that threatened to overwhelm my resolve. The truth was that we might be walking toward our own deaths in pursuit of a man who was already beyond our help. But James Carson deserved better than being left to rot in some forgotten corner of the Alaska wilderness. The trail to Blackwater Gorge proved more treacherous than anything we'd encountered so far, winding through passes where avalanches had carved fresh scars in the mountainsides and across frozen streams that groaned ominously under our weight. Tommy's endurance amazed me as he struggled through snow that sometimes reached his chest, never complaining even when I could see exhaustion etched into every line of his young face. "Your father would be proud of you," I told him during one of our brief rest stops, watching him share his meager ration of dried meat with the ravens that had begun following our strange procession. "James always said that true strength wasn't about being the biggest or the strongest, but about keeping going when everything inside you wants to quit." The boy looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than they had just days ago, the innocence stripped away by witnessing Dolan's death and learning the truth about his father's fate. "Do you think Pa suffered?" he asked quietly, the question hanging between us like a sword waiting to fall. I chose my words carefully, knowing that some truths were too brutal for young hearts to bear. "I think your father died fighting, Tommy. Men like James Carson don't go gentle into that good night." The lie came easier than it should have, but sometimes mercy matters more than honesty. By mid-afternoon, we reached the rim of Blackwater Gorge, and the sight that greeted us stole the breath from my lungs like a physical blow. The gorge dropped away beneath our feet for what looked like hundreds of feet, its walls carved from black granite that seemed to swallow light and hope with equal hunger. A frozen waterfall hung suspended down one side like a cathedral's organ, pipes made of ice, beautiful and terrible in its alien magnificence. At the bottom of the gorge, barely visible through the swirling mists that rose from the depths, I could make out the dark shape of what might have been a cabin or mine entrance, carved into the living rock. "That's where the map says Pa's claim is," Tommy said, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the gorge like the voices of the damned. "But how are we supposed to get down there?" The question that had been haunting me since we'd left Dolan's body behind now demanded an answer. The trail marked on the crude map seemed to indicate a path down the eastern wall, but from our vantage point, I couldn't see anything that looked remotely passable. The rope in my pack might be long enough to reach the bottom, but there would be no guarantee we could climb back up, especially if we found James's body and tried to bring it with us. I spent the next hour studying the gorge from every angle, looking for any route that wouldn't end in our deaths on the jagged rocks below. The shadows were growing longer as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, and I knew we had precious little daylight left to make our attempt. "There," I said finally, pointing to a series of natural ledges that zigzagged down the northern wall like a giant staircase. "It's not much of a path, but it's the only chance we've got." Tommy peered over the edge with the fearless curiosity of youth, though I could see his hands trembling as he gripped the rim of the gorge. "What if we fall?" he asked, voicing the fear that was eating at both our hearts. "Then we'll fall together," I replied, trying to inject more confidence into my voice than I actually felt. "But your father didn't survive the war and half a dozen Alaskan winters just to have his son give up when things got difficult." The words seemed to straighten Tommy's spine, and I watched him transform before my eyes from a frightened child into something approaching the man his father had been. The sight filled me with pride and terror in equal measure, knowing that we were about to risk everything on a desperate gamble. But some promises are too sacred to break, even when keeping them might cost us our lives. The descent began as a nightmare of loose rock and treacherous footing, each step a calculated risk that could send us tumbling into the abyss below. I went first, testing each handhold and foothold before allowing Tommy to follow, the rope between us our only lifeline in this vertical hell. The granite walls wept with ice that made every surface slick and unpredictable, and more than once, I felt my boots slip on patches of black ice that could have ended our journey in an instant. "Don't look down," I called back to Tommy, though I could hear the strain in his breathing that told me he was fighting his own battle with vertigo and fear. "Just focus on the next handhold, nothing else." Halfway down the wall, we reached a ledge barely wide enough for both of us to stand, and I called a halt to let Tommy rest and assess our progress. The cabin at the bottom of the gorge was more clearly visible now, its roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. Dark stains in the snow around the structure made my stomach clench with dread, but I forced myself to study the scene with the detachment of a hunter reading sign. "We're almost there," I told Tommy, though the hardest part of our descent still lay ahead. The final 100 feet would take us down a nearly vertical face with precious few handholds and no room for error. When we finally reached the bottom of the gorge, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand, and Tommy collapsed onto his hands and knees in the snow, gasping for breath in the thin air. The silence down here was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of settling ice and the whisper of wind through the stone walls high above us. The cabin squatted against the far wall of the gorge like a wounded animal, its door hanging open on broken hinges that spoke of violence and desperation. "Stay close to me," I whispered to Tommy as we approached the structure, my rifle ready despite knowing that whatever dangers had once lurked here were long since frozen solid. The dark stains in the snow resolved themselves into what could only be blood, now black with age and partially covered by more recent snowfall. "Is this where Pa died?" Tommy asked, his voice small and frightened in the cathedral silence of the gorge. "I think so, child. But we're here to take him home, remember? To give him the proper burial he deserves." The words felt hollow, even as I spoke them, but they seemed to give Tommy the courage he needed to follow me toward the cabin's gaping doorway. Inside that broken structure lay the answers we'd traveled so far to find, but I was no longer sure I wanted to know what Marcus Dolan had done to James Carson in this godforsaken place. The cabin's interior was a scene from hell, with overturned furniture and frozen pools of blood that told the story of James Carson's final moments better than any words could have. Tommy gasped and pressed his face against my coat, unable to look at the carnage that surrounded us, while I forced myself to search through the wreckage for any sign of his father's remains. "He ain't here," I said finally, the relief in my voice surprising me with its intensity. "Dolan must have moved the body somewhere else." But even as I spoke, my eyes were drawn to a section of the cabin's floor where the boards had been pried up and hastily replaced. The wood was darker there, stained with something that made my skin crawl with revulsion and understanding. "Tommy," I said quietly, "I need you to wait outside while I check something." The boy nodded and stumbled toward the door, probably grateful for any excuse to escape the horror that filled this place like a living thing. When he was gone, I used my knife to pry up the loose floorboards, revealing a shallow grave that contained what was left of James Carson. The sight of that tarnished metal lying on his chest, identical to the one Tommy wore, finally broke the dam of emotions I'd been holding back since we'd begun this journey. I knelt in the blood-soaked earth and wept for the friend I'd lost, the father Tommy would never know, and the innocence that had died in all of us. The task of retrieving James's body from that makeshift grave was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But Tommy deserved to have his father's remains treated with dignity rather than left to rot in Marcus Dolan's crude hiding place. I wrapped what I found in my spare blankets, trying to preserve whatever dignity death had left him, while Tommy waited outside in the growing darkness. "Is it really him?" the boy asked when I emerged from the cabin, his young voice cracking with grief and exhaustion. "It's him, child. And now we're going to take him home." The words came out stronger than I felt, but I could see that Tommy needed to hear them, needed to believe that our journey had meaning beyond the violence and death we'd witnessed. Getting back up the gorge wall with James's remains would be nearly impossible, but I'd made a promise to a dead man's spirit and to his living son. "We'll make camp here tonight," I decided, looking up at the stone walls that surrounded us like the walls of a tomb. "Tomorrow we'll find a way to get your father out of this place and give him the burial he deserves." The stars were beginning to appear in the narrow strip of sky visible between the gorge walls, cold and distant as the hope that we'd all make it home alive. But some promises are worth dying for, and James Carson's son deserved to know that his father hadn't been forgotten in this frozen hell. The night we spent in Blackwater Gorge was the longest of my life, filled with the kind of bone-deep cold that seeps into your soul and never leaves. Tommy and I huddled together beside a small fire I'd built from debris scattered around the ruined cabin, while James Carson's body lay wrapped in blankets a few feet away like a silent accusation. "Tell me about my pa," Tommy whispered as the flames danced between us, his young face gaunt with exhaustion and grief. "Tell me what he was like before he came to Alaska." So I did, sharing stories of the man who'd been my husband's closest friend, the soldier who'd saved Samuel's life in Cuba, the dreamer who'd believed that gold and glory waited just beyond the next mountain. He used to say that Alaska was God's way of testing whether a man was worth the breath in his lungs, I told Tommy, watching the firelight play across his features. "Your father passed that test every day he was alive, right up until the end." The boy listened with the intensity of someone memorizing every word, storing up these fragments of his father's life like precious stones. When he finally fell asleep against my shoulder, I stared up at the stars and wondered how we were going. To climb out of this gorge with a dead man's body and a living child who was depending on me to get him home. The mountain walls around us seemed to press closer in the darkness, but I'd made too many promises to give up now. Dawn came slowly to the bottom of Blackwater Gorge, filtering down through the narrow gap between stone walls like pale honey poured from heaven's table. I woke to find Tommy sitting beside the cold ashes of our fire, staring at the bundle that contained his father's remains with an expression that belonged on a much older face. The night had changed him in ways that sleep could never heal, adding weight to his young shoulders that would bend but never break his spirit. "We can't carry him up the wall," he said quietly, his voice carrying the flat acceptance of someone who'd learned that the world rarely offered easy answers. "The rope won't hold all three of us, and even if it did, we ain't strong enough to haul a dead man up that rock face." His words cut through my heart like cold steel, but I couldn't argue with the brutal mathematics of our situation. The climb that had nearly killed us coming down would be impossible with James Carson's body weighing us down like an anchor. "Then we'll find another way," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew we were trapped in this stone tomb with precious few options left. The morning air carried the promise of another storm, and the shadows on the gorge walls warned that we had maybe 6 hours of good light before darkness claimed us again. I spent the next hour exploring every inch of the gorge floor, looking for any passage or cave that might offer an alternative route to the surface. The walls rose around us like the ribs of some ancient beast, smooth and unforgiving in their vertical sweep toward the sky above. But near the base of the frozen waterfall, I found something that made my heart leap with desperate hope. A narrow crack in the stone that seemed to lead deeper into the mountain rather than up toward salvation. "Tommy," I called, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Come look at this." The boy approached with the careful steps of someone who'd learned not to trust hope too easily, but I could see curiosity flickering in his eyes as he peered into the dark opening. "It's a cave," he said, stating the obvious with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when adults are being particularly slow. "Might be it goes all the way through the mountain, comes out somewhere we can climb." The possibility seemed too good to be true, but desperate people have always been willing to gamble everything on the longest of odds. "We'd be walking blind into the heart of the mountain," I warned him, though I was already mentally calculating what supplies we'd need for such a journey. "No guarantees it leads anywhere but deeper into the darkness." Tommy looked back at his father's wrapped body, then up at the impossible walls that surrounded us, and I watched him make the same calculations that were running through my own mind. Pa always said that when you're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, sometimes the only choice is to dive deeper and hope you can swim. The wisdom in those words hit me like a revelation, and I realized that James Carson was still teaching his son lessons about survival and courage from beyond the grave. "Then we dive deeper," I said, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me as we committed ourselves to this final gamble. "But first, we're going to do right by your father." I'd been carrying a small leather Bible in my pack since leaving the cabin, one of the few possessions I'd salvaged from my old life with Samuel. James Carson deserves proper words said over him before we carry him into that darkness. Tommy nodded solemnly and helped me arrange his father's body with the dignity that death demands from the living. The metal around his neck caught the pale morning light one last time, and I thought I saw something that might have been approval in the way it gleamed against the dark cloth. We were about to honor the dead by risking everything to keep the living safe. The funeral service I conducted in that God-forsaken gorge was brief but heartfelt, with words drawn from scripture and memory to honor a man who died far from home and family. "James Carson was a soldier and a friend," I said, my voice carrying across the stone walls like a prayer ascending to heaven. "He served his country with honor, loved his son with all his heart, and died trying to build a better life for the boy he'd never see grow to manhood." Tommy stood beside me with tears freezing on his cheeks, but his young back was straight and his chin was high as he listened to the truth about his father's character. The medal he wore belonged to his best friend, my husband Samuel, given in love and worn in remembrance of bonds that death cannot break. I took the tarnished medal from around James's neck and placed it over Tommy's head, where it settled, against his chest like a blessing passed from father to son. "Now he'll watch over you the way he watched over Samuel, and you'll carry both their memories in your heart until the day you join them in whatever comes after this hard world." The ceremony felt both inadequate and perfect, honoring the dead while preparing the living for whatever lay ahead in the mountain's dark heart. When I closed the Bible, the echo seemed to linger in the air like a promise that some things are stronger than death. Carrying James Carson's body into the cave felt like descending into the bowels of the earth itself, but I'd made too many promises to leave him behind in that cursed gorge. The passage was narrow and treacherous, forcing us to drag our burden through spaces barely wide enough for a grown person to squeeze through sideways. Tommy carried our last torch, its flickering light, casting dancing shadows on walls that seemed to press closer with every step we took into the mountain's heart. "How far you think it goes?" he whispered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness that surrounded us on all sides. "Far enough," I replied, though I had no more idea than he did whether we were walking toward salvation or a tomb that would hold all three of us for eternity. The air grew colder as we went deeper, and I could feel the weight of millions of tons of rock pressing down above our heads, like the judgment of an angry god. But every step took us away from the impossible. Walls of Blackwater Gorge, and sometimes the only way out is through the very heart of what scares you most. "Your father would be proud," I told Tommy as we paused to rest in a slightly wider section of the passage. Not many men would have the courage to walk into hell itself to do right by the dead. 3 hours into our underground journey, when I was beginning to fear that we'd trapped ourselves in a stone maze with no exit, I felt something that made my heart soar with desperate hope. A breath of air moving through the darkness ahead of us. "Do you feel that?" I asked Tommy, who was struggling with exhaustion and the thin air of our underground prison. "Feel what?" he gasped, but then his eyes widened as the same breeze that had touched my face reached him. "Wind," he breathed, the single word carrying more hope than any prayer I'd ever heard. "There's wind coming from up ahead." We pressed forward with renewed energy, dragging James's body through passages that grew gradually wider and higher until we could finally stand upright again. The darkness ahead of us began to show traces of gray that spoke of daylight filtering down from somewhere far above our heads. "We're going to make it," I told Tommy, though I was afraid to believe it myself until I could see blue sky with my own eyes. "Your father's going to see sunlight again, and you're going to live to tell his story to your own children someday." The thought filled me with a peace I hadn't felt since Samuel's death, as if completing this impossible journey might finally lay the ghosts that had haunted me for so many years. But the mountain had one last test waiting for us in the gray light ahead. The cave mouth opened onto a snow-covered ledge high on the eastern face of the mountain, with a view that stretched for hundreds of miles across the Alaska wilderness. The sight of open sky after hours in the underground darkness brought tears to my eyes, but our situation was still desperate. We were stranded on a narrow shelf of rock with no obvious way down to the valley floor below. "At least it's better than the gorge," Tommy said, displaying the kind of dark humor that his father would have appreciated. "At least we can see where we are now." I studied the cliff face below us, looking for any route that might get us down safely with our precious burden, when I noticed something that made my heart skip with surprise and hope. Smoke was rising from a valley settlement maybe 5 miles to the north, too far to reach on foot, but close enough to signal if we could attract attention. "Tommy," I said, pointing toward the distant curl of smoke. "That's Copper Creek Station. If we can get their attention, they might send help." The boy's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since we'd left my cabin, and I realized that our journey was finally approaching something that might pass for a happy ending. But getting down from this ledge would require one last act of faith and courage from both of us. The solution came to me as I studied the angle of the slope below our precarious perch, remembering techniques Samuel had taught me for moving heavy loads down steep terrain. "We're going to build a sled," I announced, already scanning the area for materials that might serve our purpose. "Use the cave mouth as shelter while we work, and the slope of the mountain to carry us down to that valley." Tommy looked at me, with the expression of someone who wasn't sure whether I was brilliant or completely insane, but he helped me gather fallen branches and strips of cloth to construct a makeshift toboggan. "Will it hold together?" he asked, as we lashed the crude frame with rope and prayer. "It doesn't have to last forever," I replied, testing the joints with more confidence than I actually felt. "It just has to get us down to where people can help." As we carefully loaded James Carson's body onto our improvised sled and prepared for what might be our final gamble, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this impossible place. A lost boy in a blizzard, a tarnished medal, and a promise made to the dead. Such simple things to hang our lives on, but sometimes the smallest acts of faith are the ones that save us. "Hold on tight, Tommy," I said, as we positioned ourselves on the sled behind his father's body. "We're going home." The ride down the mountainside was a terrifying blur of speed and snow, with Tommy clinging to me and both of us holding onto James Carson's body as we rocketed toward the valley floor below. The crude sled held together better than I dared. Hope, carrying us through drifts and over obstacles that should have killed us all, but somehow delivered us intact to the bottom of the slope, where the snow was deep enough to cushion our landing. "We made it," Tommy gasped, rolling off the sled and lying in the snow like a starfish, his young face bright with amazement and relief. We actually made it. I looked back up the mountain toward Blackwater Gorge, now invisible behind peaks and distance, and felt the weight of our ordeal settling into my bones like lead. "Yes, child," I said quietly. "We made it." The settlement at Copper Creek was close enough now that we could walk there before nightfall, and I knew there would be questions about the body we carried and the blood on our clothes. But Tommy Carson would grow up knowing that his father had been a man worth saving, worth honoring, worth the terrible journey we'd made to bring him home. The medal around the boy's neck caught the afternoon sunlight as we prepared for the final leg of our journey, and I thought I could feel Samuel's approval warming my heart like a coal from heaven's hearth. Some promises are too sacred to break, no matter what the cost, and love is stronger than death when it has work left to do in the world of the living.